only know one side or the angle, or you're trying to find the angle, here are the steps we use again. So the first thing we do is look at the figure and decide whether we need to use sine, cosine, or tangent. How do you do that? Well, remember that sine deals with opposite and hypotenuse, so if those are the parts you have, you use sine. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so if you have the adjacent side and the hypotenuse, you use cosine. Tangent uses the opposite side and the adjacent side, so if you have opposite and adjacent, you would use tangent. Once you've decided which you need to use, you would set up the equation just like this. If it's sine you're using, you would write sine of angle, and here you would either put the measure of your angle, or if you don't know the angle, you would put its variable. Equals, and then you put your length here. And then we use algebra and our calculator to solve for the missing variable. So here are the basic steps that we'll go through each time, and you just have to go carefully deciding what do I have and how am I going to get it if it's not there. This question says find the measure of angle B. So I'm going to put, here's angle B. Okay. I'm looking to see what's the measure of that angle. Now, anytime you have that, you know if you're trying to find the measure of an angle, we're going to be using our inverses on our calculator, just as a heads up. But we start the same way. Are we going to be using sine, cosine, or tangent? Well, for this angle, what do we have? These two sides, what are they? For this angle, are they opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse? What are we working with? Well, here's our hypotenuse. So we have the hypotenuse, and then this leg is touching our angle, so that's our adjacent leg. What uses adjacent and hypotenuse? Is that sine, cosine, or tangent? Well, hopefully you have those ratios written in your notes and you know that cosine uses adjacent and hypotenuse. So we set up our equation. We write cosine of the angle. Do we know the measure of the angle? We do not. We only know that it's angle B, and we're going to need to solve for it. So cosine of the angle equals adjacent, which was length 6, over the hypotenuse, which had a length of 8. Okay. Our job now is to evaluate that and solve it using a calculator. Well, let's take a look at what we can simplify. Well, I could find the decimal for that. You take top divided by bottom. 6 divided by 8 is 0.75. So now I have the cosine of B is equal to 0.75. I need to get B by itself. I need to solve for that. So we do the opposite of cosine. Do you know what the opposite of cosine is? It's inverse cosine. Okay, so that's where our inverse button is going to come in. And again, you will know to use it anytime you don't know an angle and you're trying to find an angle. And the way this works is we do the inverse cosine of both sides of the equation. Cosine and inverse cosine cancel. And so my answer is going to be whatever the inverse cosine of 0.75 is. So I would just take out my calculator. Remember, to do inverses, you put the number first, so 0.75. Then I push inverse, and then notice my cosine button here has the inverse on it. And I get 41.4. It says round to the nearest degree, so I round to 41. So the measure of angle B is 41 degrees. Now notice that worked a little differently than when the problems where we tried to find the length of a side. I know it's going to be different when they ask me to find an angle instead of a side length. Hey, here's another example. Find the measure of angle L. Again, they're asking me to find an angle, so I know I'm probably going to be working with inverses here. Here's my angle. I'm just going to call it angle L since they already have a variable for it. Okay. What do we need to use? Sine, cosine, or tangent? Well, for this angle, here's the hypotenuse. We have the hypotenuse and the opposite side for that angle. Here's the adjacent side. It was not labeled. We have the opposite and hypotenuse. What uses opposite and hypotenuse? Is that sine, cosine, or tangent? Hopefully you have that and you said sine because sine is opposite over hypotenuse. We set up the equation. The sine of the angle. Do we know the angle measure? We do not. All we know is it's angle L, so we just put L. Equals opposite, the length of the opposite side was 10.2, over hypotenuse, the length of the hypotenuse was 18.4. We need to calculate the value of angle L. So again, anytime you're looking for an angle, you need to use inverses. The reason for that is this over here is just a number, okay, the 10.2 or 18.4. I need to get rid of sine here so that I can just have L. The opposite of sine is inverse sine. So this is kind of what it looks like. We just take the inverse sine of both sides. That cancels our sine here and leaves us with just L. Whatever we do on one side, we have to do to the other. So L is going to be equal to the inverse sine of 10.2 over 18.4. And let's pull out our calculator and figure that out. So here are the steps we would take. First, I need to know what decimal 10.2 over 18.4 is. So I start with that. Take the top of your fraction, 10.2, and divide it by the bottom, 18.4 equals. That's the decimal here. The reason I just leave that is because it saves me rounding. You could calculate it and put 0.5543 here, but the less rounding you do, the closer you'll get to the exact answer. Okay? Well, then, so I've calculated this. Now I need to do the inverse sine of that number. So I already have the number in my calculator. I push inverse and then inverse sine right there. And I get 33.665. It wanted rounded to the nearest degree, so the 0.6 would make this round up to 34 degrees. So the measure of angle L would be 34 degrees here. All right, here's one more example. We're asked to find the measure of angle D. So here's our angle D. And again, I'm trying to find an angle, so I know I'm going to be working with inverses. Here's my angle. I don't know its measure. What do we need to use? Sine, cosine, or tangent. So here's my angle. The two sides I know, what are they? Opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse. Well, here's the hypotenuse, and we don't know it. Okay? We do know the opposite leg. Here's the opposite leg for angle D. And the adjacent leg, the leg touching it. What uses opposite and adjacent? Is it sine, cosine, or tangent? Hopefully you said tangent, because that is what we need to use. Then we set up the equation, tangent of the angle. Do we know the angle? We do not. We just know that it's angle D. So I just write tangent D equals opposite leg. The opposite leg was length 12 over the adjacent leg, which was length 20. And I'm set. Now I just need to calculate that. Okay, how do I do that? Well, I need to get rid of tangent. So to get rid of tangent, when you don't know the number there, you do the inverse tangent of both sides. So my answer is going to be D is equal to the inverse tangent of 12 over 20. So I take out my calculator. Clear it out. First, calculate 12 over 20. So you take the top 12 divided by the bottom 20. Gives me 0.6. So this number here is 0.6. And now I need to do the inverse tangent of that. Leave the number in there, push inverse, and then inverse tangent. And I get 30.963. They wanted me to round to the nearest degree. That 0.9 would round that up to 31. So my answer is that D is 31 degrees.